And I think that in the ground of our being, there is that desire to be of service, and yet somehow it gets pushed down, and we listen to rhetoric too that pushes it down. And when you were talking, Dave, about having a platform, how journalists have a platform and nonfiction writers like myself have a platform, we have a responsibility to the truth. And we have to say no when people are out there just saying bold-faced lies and keep repeating bold-faced lies. I mean, I couldn't believe it when the Vice President of the United States, the current Vice President, admitted that this whole thing about people eating pets in Springfield, Ohio was not true. But it was okay to say it, in his opinion, because it drove home a point that cities are being overrun by immigrants. Well, it's not okay. It wasn't true. It was not true. And the people in Springfield, Ohio knew it, and they tried to say it, and it kept on getting repeated. And we have got to say as a country and a society, no, stop that.
Everybody, welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. Glad to have you here. We have a great author on the show. Judith is here, and we're going to be talking about her books and her writing. She comes with great experience, and she's got some great things to share with you, some great stories, some great lessons as well for you as a fellow author. Really excited to have Judith here. Judith, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. Glad to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dave. It's an honor. Thank you.
Excellent. Judith, tell everybody where you are in this great big world of
In
ours.
this great big world, I am in central Illinois, which is about 2.5 hours south of this great city of Chicago. I spent much of my career in Chicago, but then I married a gentleman in this community of Normal, Illinois. That's exactly where I am. And Illinois State is here, and Illinois Wesleyan University is here. So it's basically a college town.
Beautiful. Excellent. Have you been grown up in that part of the world? Is that where you're from?
No, I grew up in the shadow of New York City in Bayonne, New Jersey, where I could see the Statue of Liberty, which my Italian grandparents, all four of them, saw coming into America. I could see the Verrazano Narrows Bridge from our house in Bayonne, New Jersey. So, no, I'm also pretty much a New Yorker as well as a Chicagoan and Midwesterner now.
There you go. All right. Excellent. I love New York City. I've been there many times. And you say you leave your heart in San Francisco. I think I left my soul in New York. So I love it there. It's beautiful. Excellent. Judith, tell us a little bit about your author journey. How did all this start for you? What was the initial draw to using words and sharing your stories?
Well, to tell you the honest truth, I've known I wanted to be a writer since I was 4 years old. And even before I could knew how to write, I would compose these poems in my head, and my older brother would write them down for me. And so I've always had this love of writing, the love of language, the love of words. And my first love was poetry. I thought I would be a poet, and realized pretty quickly that poets earn in the high, 2 figures salary. And I went on to get interested in journalism, and much of my career was in journalism. I worked for the Wall Street Journal, and before that, the Washington Post. And I always say I had the greatest graduate school education at the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. I was very young. I was hired when I was 21 by the Washington Post, and had a wonderful journalism career. Went into television and learned how to write to pictures and audio. Did work for 2 NPR stations, and then my heart was really in spirituality writing. I became very interested in how to live a more contemplative life in the everyday world, the secular world that I had to live in. Started to spend a lot of time in monasteries and do a lot of studying of mystics, the contemplative life. And that brought me on a path. 6 spirituality books later brought me on a path of writing spirituality, nonfiction. But also, I've just completed my 3rd collection of poetry. And so that's been, in a way, I've gone back to my first love in writing, which was poetry.
Now, if we could have this imagined audience coming to a conference around writing. You are the upcoming speaker who's going to come up on stage and speak to a room full of authors who are here to eagerly learn from you and your background, your experience from journalism to writing. There's so much that you could talk about. What would be your subject? What would you come with a subject for authors to encourage them? What would you talk about?
I talk about writing what you're passionate about. Because if you're passionate about something, chances are you are able through your writing to make other people passionate about it as well. And that's, I really wrote my spirituality books for people like me, people interested in being contemplative. Contemplatives in action is a phrase that I like. And so, I've had success in getting these books out because I feel so passionate about the subject. And luckily, other people do too, and they want to read those books. So I think the first thing you want to do is really search your heart about what really matters to you, and that's what you write about.
Is there anything else that you draw from that gives you inspiration? Music, art, anything else that kind of fills up your mind as well as you write?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, nature is a great inspiration. For example, whenever I'm stuck on a line or a paragraph or a reflection I'm trying to write, I take a walk. I walk among the trees. And you'd be surprised how that frees up something in the psyche. And you come back refreshed, and you might have a whole different idea for writing that paragraph or that reflection, how to begin it, for example, than whatever stumped you to begin with. And then this will sound maybe a little crazy to you, Dave, but cooking is one of my contemplative practices. And a lot of times when I'm stuck, I'm tired in the writing, I'll get in the kitchen, I'll start some pasta sauce and I'll start, chopping some vegetables. And I like asparagus. I love asparagus. I love eggplant, but you got to chop those, and that too frees something up in the mind where you can go back then to your writing a bit refreshed.
So my ask of you is to tell me what time dinner is, because I'm going to head out now and head my way to you because I can't wait to try that sauce. So what else as far as other creatives? Is there somebody that you like to read? Is there music you like to listen to as well?
Well, I grew up going to Broadway shows, Broadway musicals, and to listen to the lyrics of Broadway musicals. I mean, that had a huge influence on me when I was young because they're so clever. The words have to be so exact, and particularly Stephen Sondheim. If you listen to his lyrics, they're very high caliber poetry. And Jerry Herman was another composer that I absolutely loved. Jerry Herman, he just passed away a few years ago. And I got to meet him one time. I got to meet him, shake his hand, do an interview with him when I was working for PBS TV. So that kind of music really inspired me as a young person. And then I grew up in the 70s, sort of. That was kind of my era, 70s, 80s. And there were great singer-songwriters in that era. Billy Joel is a favorite of mine. He often wrote about New York, a New York state of mind. And so one of his best songs. And so I could relate to everything. Scenes from an Italian restaurant, another of his well-known songs. I could relate to all of his lyrics. And I absolutely, gorged on Joni Mitchell, for example. Loved, I still think she's might be the best female composer of that era or any era of the pop songs. So those were big influences on me. And I think my journalism, particularly being hired so young at the age of 21 at the Wall Street Journal, you're trained to be a careful observer. And that's very helpful then when you're going to write books. And you learn how to coalesce, especially at the Wall Street Journal. Their articles tend to be on the longer side. When I went to the Wall Street Journal, I learned how to coalesce a lot of information, a lot of diverse bits of information, allow them to coalesce into a whole that people could digest easily. And So I credit first of all, poetry making me a lover of words and trying to find interesting and exact words. And then my journalism for making me an observer and allowing me to coalesce a lot of information so that other people could absorb it easily.
When you write for journalism, you're also writing with a deadline. You have a newspaper that has to go out. How does writing under a deadline help you today as an author? Does it motivate you? Is it a good discipline?
Absolutely. It does get the adrenaline going. And my husband,
Yeah.
always jokes that still a deadline writer, even when I'm writing my books. And part of it is I allow my research to marinate a long time in my mind. So even if I'm not sitting at the computer putting words down on the computer screen, I'm composing in my mind. And I'll give you a really quick example. I have to write. I have to write something, a message for the International Thomas Merton Society. They're having their conference in a month, and I have to write. I'm the president of that, and I have to write a message. And so I laid in bed last night, and I just sort of composed my message in my head. And so later on today, when I sit down at the computer, I really have a lot worked out in my head already.
So you're not coming with a blank slate, a blank paper. You already formulated at least a starting point, a foundation.
Right. And that way you're not staring at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper, which can be very intimidating.
I guess as journalists, you don't really have the luxury of being stuck and not having ideas. You have to create. That's your job. You have to produce. For those people who do suffer possibly from writer's block or a lack of inspiration, is there any kind of tips and things that you learned early on in journalism that helped you?
I did. Early on in my journalism career, I came across a quote from E.B. White, the famous New Yorker columnist, writer, and he wrote The Elements of Style, a book about grammatical rules and such. And he said, writing comes down to this. It is the applying the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. In other words, get in your chair and just start writing. And that's also a very helpful thing too. If you're stuck and when I'm stuck, I just start writing without editing myself. And you always can go back over it and revise, toss out things, toss out paragraphs, toss out whole pages, move pages around. But it's good to just, get in there and just start writing stream of conscious without being self-conscious and without self-editing at that first go-round.
Do you think that reading and being an active reader helps or hinders you as an author?
Oh no, Dave, it's such a good point you make. No, absolutely. I think it was Theodore Roethke who said, writers worth reading are readers. And, find somebody whose work you really liked. I mean, growing up, when I was younger, I thought, Ernest Hemingway was, the cat's meow as far as writing goes. And so I read everything Hemingway wrote. And then I was in a Thomas Wolfe phase, who's a very different writer, very different writer than Hemingway. But, reading everything then that Thomas Wolfe wrote helped me get to a next level in my writing. And so as a poet, find the poets whose poems really speak to you. I was a lover of Marie Howe's poetry. She just won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry. But I have been reading Marie Howe since the 1990s, and her poetry really spoke to me. And I found when I started to write poetry again, I would use the couplet. A lot of Marie's poems are in couplets. So I kind of made that form my own. And Mary Oliver is another great poet. And I've read everything. I've read her fiction. Her nonfiction and her poetry.
Yeah.
And she has helped me a great deal. So you find people you like, you try to imitate them at the beginning, and then you work your way into your own voice. it's almost a mystical process.
I heard somebody say their motto is to steal like an artist.
Yeah.
And I'm like, interesting. Like, steal the inspiration, steal the motivation. The one thing I would think from an author's perspective is if you fall in love with a particular writer or style, then you're going to maybe drift towards that yourself and you sound like your favorite author. But I think the one thing that's unique about creative people is you're a mixture of all of the different elements.
Right.
You talk about living in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty. You talk about New York City. You talk about pasta sauce, your family, your history. All of these things make you uniquely you, and there's no one else like you, ever, anywhere. So your perspective as you sit down to write, even if you're influenced by this author or that music or this thing, still it's a combination of all of those things make you unique, even with that kind of influence on your life.
Absolutely. And you'll find you'll work your way into your own voice. Obviously, you're not going to go very far if you just imitate Hemingway,
Right.
Because he was an original. So you then have to become your own original. Yeah. I neglected to say visual art has been a big influence on me. And I always liked the Impressionists. And, I studied French I studied French for 6 years in the U.S. and then I went to the Sorbonne for a semester. And I love the French Impressionists, and I really liked Cézanne. He's kind of not as popular now as Van Gogh and Monet and some of the others, but I always liked Cézanne because of those little details that you would see in his still life visual art. And I try to, walk into a room and try to see the way Cézanne might have seen. He would pick up on these small little details. And so visual art, also studying the Impressionists when I was studying French in college and then over at the Sorbonne really helped as well.
I would think understanding and recognizing small details, as he would do in painting in his art, is a transferable practice for authors. The small details when you're writing as well, combined together with the story, helps the story. Would you agree with that?
That's what makes it come alive, are these small details. I remember one of my first editors at the Washington Post, Leonard Downey, would say, what really will make your story come alive is the detail. The precise details, helping people to really get a picture of a place or to really get a feel for how someone talked. If you used quotes, use the quotes that really show something about their personality. Yeah.
I was interviewing an author, a gentleman, and he was writing a romantic story from a woman's point of view, which is a big task for him. He admitted it was a big task. And when he put his book out for some feedback from a female audience of authors, they're like, the details. There's no details. It's a wedding scene. What kind of flowers? Yeah. How long was the dress? What was this? What was they were coming back to him with, there's no details. It's all like big picture. Get down to the details. So he had to learn how to bring in that kind of detail so that he could connect with his readers.
Yeah. I'll give you an example. My husband was writing a short story. He's a judge, but he's a writing judge. He's a judge who loves to write short stories and poetry. And one of the characters in his short story was a developmentally challenged young child, and there wasn't anything except the stating of the fact that he was developmentally challenged. And I said, think about our neighbor's grandson, who is developmentally challenged and does the most wonderful, funny things. Like often he'll take a knickknack and walk around the house with this knickknack, holding this knickknack over his head, and details like that. He's attached to certain stuffed animals that he has. Those details would really make this child in the story come alive for people. And luckily, my husband totally got it. So yeah, rewrote the story.
That's interesting. So, yeah, I think details is great. You mentioned earlier that it takes a while for somebody to find their voice. For you as an author, did you find your voice in your 20s as a journalist, or was it a little bit later on that you finally found out your unique voice as an author?
Yeah, I think I probably was at the Wall Street Journal, sort of in my 30s. My 20s was the Washington Post. My 30s was the Wall Street Journal. And, suddenly it just sort of happened, that I understood how to really make a person come alive that I was profiling. What kind of quotes would make that person come alive? What kind of detail about their life would be a very telling detail? And so I think, I credit those 8 years at the Wall Street Journal with really helping me become a good writer. The Washington Post helped me become a good observer, a good reporter, a very good reporter. And then my writing skills were honed at the Wall Street Journal. But then I went back to graduate school after Washington Post and Wall Street Journal to get an MFA in creative writing with a focus on poetry. And, graduate school isn't for everybody. I don't say everybody has to have an MFA. But what it did was it freed me up to do all different kinds of writing, essay writing, for example, personal essay writing, for example, experimental writing, in addition to poetry, which was my, and I did some fiction writing too. So it kind of freed you up to do a different kind of writing than I had been doing in journalism. And something that's really important is if you have a mentor, for example, I had a graduate school advisor named Rose Ellen Brown. Some of your listeners may know her novels. One of them was made into a movie called Before and After with Liam Neeson and Meryl Streep. That was her novel, Before and After. That was probably her most famous novel. But, Rose Ellen is a Jewish woman. And I was writing about faith, my faith as a Catholic and Catholic characters and sort of a Catholic sensibility. Catholics love things that are sensual. The Mass is very sensual with the bells and the incense and the this and that. And Rose Ellen got that. And she drew that out of me and said, this is what you're passionate about, the spiritual life. That's what you need to write about. And, she didn't want me to be the writer that she was or to write the way she writes, which I couldn't do anyway. But she wanted me to be the writer she thought or she knew I could be, or that I knew I could be, maybe is a better way of putting it. So you have to have a mentor who's not going to make you like them, mold you in their image, but let you become the writer that you can be.
That's great advice for the people listening, Judith, to hear that as well. That's probably very timely, I think, for the people that are listening to this podcast today, because maybe they haven't heard somebody explain it that way. And now it's going to sink in a little bit deeper, hearing that from you with your background. Those are wise words.
Yeah. So if you're in a writing program right now, an MFA program, and your advisor or your fellow students are tearing up your work, don't worry about it. You need to be in another school. You need to be in another class. You've got to do what really you're meant to write. You have to write what you're meant to write, and don't let anybody else tell you differently. Watch the movie Wildcat about Flannery O'Connor, which is just out late last year, and she went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and there's this scene where she of course writes this this brilliant scene of a novel she's working on, and somebody in the class pipes up and says, "Yeah, but I don't get." And Robert Lowell, who's the instructor, just cuts that kid off, because Robert Lowell, who's a famous poet at that point, knows that he has heard brilliance from Flannery O'Connor.
For the readers that are listening to our conversation, Judith, they're here maybe not to learn how to write a book. They're here to fall in love with you as an author. And I'm curious, with everything, you have so much to offer to a reader from all the things that you put out there. Is there a good starting point for somebody new to your writing, where you would say, if I was coming to my books for the first time, I think a good starting point would be this book. Is there a good starting point?
Well, Dave, you've asked an interesting question because every writer is in love with their most recent book. Their
Right,
favorite
right.
child is their most recent book. So I would love
Yep.
for people to start with The Italian Soul, which is about what we can learn from the Italian lifestyle, about living more mindfully and joyfully. And but other books that people have seem to enjoy a lot is one called The Art of Pausing, which is a book that I wrote with a Trappist monk, believe it or not, named Brother Paul Quinnen, a cloistered monk. And he and I love the haiku form of poetry, the 3 lines, 17 syllables. So we used to exchange a haiku a day. And then we thought, why don't we add reflections, brief reflections on the interior life, the spiritual life, to go with these haiku. And that became our book, The Art of Pausing, Meditations for the Overworked and Overwhelmed. And that book came out in 2013, and it's still selling very, very well. And then I did an anthology. My first book was an anthology called 20 Poems to Nourish Your Soul, where I took poems from people like Mary Oliver, Marie Howe, Billy Collins, and wrote kind of spiritual reflections. I wouldn't call them essays. They're more reflections to go with each of the poems. And I wrote it with my husband, who was at that time a circuit court judge, an Illinois judge, but also a poet. And so that book remains in print. It came out in 2005, which is kind of an amazing thing. And then my memoir called Atchison Blue, about the time I spent with the Benedictine sisters in Atchison, Kansas, at a monastery called Mount St. Scholastica, where it was really a deep dive, deep immersion into monastic life, which I was able to do as a layperson, as a married woman. And it was a life-changing experience, really, really transformative.
How do you end up there? Like, I'm like, that seems to be such a unique opportunity to be able to go there and to learn and to write and be a part of that. How did you end up there?
Well, I have a particular story, but for your listeners, monasteries accept guests all the time. I mean, hospitality is a huge monastic value. It's always been. Monasteries formed, way back in the second and third centuries to be places of refuge for people,
Yeah.
fleeing the craziness of the Roman Empire, for example, or the invasion of Huns and things like that. But so anybody can go and stay at monasteries. I went to give a program at Mount St. Scholastica at their retreat center in Atchison, Kansas, on my first book, 20 Poems to Nourish Your Soul. It was a retreat called Touching the Sacred Through Poetry. And I was so impressed with the rhythm of life. The prayers, everybody stopping for community prayers 3 times a day, and the hospitality of the sisters, how interested they were in me as an individual. I mean, I couldn't walk down a corridor and see a sister who didn't stop and talk with me, ask me where I came from, how I was enjoying my stay, how they could make it better. And I remember thinking, I've been looking for this all of my life. I have been looking for a place like this all of my life. And so I asked them if I could come back and just do interviews with the sisters and maybe write something about it, because I was a full-time journalist at the time. And so they said, oh, yes, of course. And so they invited me to come back and do this, but they were also anticipating their 150th anniversary as a monastery. And when I would go and interview the sisters, I would write up, what I wrote, but I would also reflect on the effect that conversation had on me. And they came to me one day and said, we really like what you're writing about yourself. We like it more than what you're writing about the sisters. And so would you, be open to coming here for spending an extended time here and writing about the effect that our monastic life is having on you as a professional lay woman, married woman. And that's what I did. And that became my memoir, Atchison Blue, A Search for Silence, A Spiritual Home, and a Living Faith. But anybody really can go to a monastery, and people who live in monasteries are very interesting people. They're people who are not interested in showing a facade. They'll just show you who they are. And Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, who was a monk, had a wonderful expression about how monastic people try to look for the real behind the real, the REAL, the real behind the real. And I think that I found that to be very true about monastic sisters and monks that I have met.
So if you were to take a thread through all of the different things you write and kind of your inspiration as you sit down to write your next project, is there a constant little thread that kind of ties all of what you do together?
Yeah, I think it's all about trying to be more contemplative amid the demands and distractions that we have, those of us who don't live in a monastery or an ashram. It's how to be a contemplative in action.
Why do we need that in our world today?
Well, look at our world, Dave. I mean, our world is sad. It's pathetic. It's divided. We've become tribes. And the monastic view is we are all one. And we have to get back to being one. And we've had now, I don't know, almost a whole decade of just people in our public arena who want to divide people, who want to say who's in and who's out, who's good and who's bad.
Yeah.
No. That has to stop. And we have to refocus on our common humanity and the fact that we inhabit a common home, which was a phrase that the late Pope Francis used for the earth.
Right. Yeah.
And we've got to get back to that. If it's not going to come from our leaders, it's got to come from the ground up.
And that's the power of your words, your writing, sharing your story as an author. There's a platform that comes with writing. There's a responsibility when you put your words out there and share your stories with people. You're creating community as an author with your readers, and people are influenced by authors, journalism, right? Journalists. It all has an impact that's far-reaching. I love the idea of service over self, because we're hyper-focused on serving each other and less focused on ourselves, then we kind of come together and see how we can help each other instead of seeing what makes us different and makes you different than me and me different than you. It's a little bit nicer when we're here to serve each other instead. And I love that from your background and what you studied as well.
That's an excellent way of putting it, service over self. Yeah.
There's a lack of that today, I think. And I'm in Canada and I see it here as well. I think that's one thing all of us can take from this conversation is how can we show up for others as others have shown up for you.
And I think that in the ground of our being, there is that desire to be of service, and yet somehow it gets pushed down, and we listen to rhetoric too that pushes it down. And when you were talking, Dave, about having a platform, how journalists have a platform and nonfiction writers like myself have a platform, we have a responsibility to the truth. Right. And we have to say no when people are out there just saying bold-faced lies. Right. And keep repeating bold-faced lies. I mean, I couldn't believe it when the Vice President of the United States, the current Vice President, admitted that this whole thing about people eating pets in Springfield, Ohio was not true. But it was okay to say it in his opinion because it drove home a point that cities are being overrun by immigrants. Well, it's not okay. It wasn't true.
Yeah.
It was not true.
Right.
And the people in Springfield, Ohio knew it, and they tried to say it, and it kept on getting repeated. And we have got to say as a country and a society, no, stop that.
And that's a good call for people who are listening and thinking, well, my words don't matter. I haven't found my voice yet as a writer. We need you. When you're passionate and you see the world the way you see it, there's someone else that's going to be inspired by you sharing your story and you writing that and sharing your work with the world. So it's not too late to become an author. It's not too late to share your story. It's actually welcomed. We need more of that right now.
Never too late. Never too late to start your writing. Never.
Tell me more from a poetry side for readers as well. Could you kind of give us an idea of what we're going to find through your poetry? Like, what is your heart and your love letter to readers who fall in love with your poetry?
Well, it's interesting you said love letter, because I think of my poems as love letters to life. I write poetry because I want to understand my life, but I write poetry because I love my life. And I want other people to perhaps see something of the narrative of their own lives in my poems. And with poetry, it's a paradoxical thing. The more personal you are, the more specific you are, the more universal your poem is. The more people it'll touch, the more people will be able to see themselves in your work. And so, that's the whole reason why I write. Somebody I heard speak, an author that I heard speak the other day named Kathleen Dignan. She teaches at Iona University, said she writes to say thank you to all of her teachers and mentors. And I thought that was nice too. I mean, that was another reason to write, to say thank you to all the people who have made you who you are.
That's a great perspective. I like that. Judith, while we're chatting, I'm looking at your website. It's beautiful, by the way. I love how your website flows. There's so much great information here. Take us through a little bit about what your website will give to a listener and a reader, a fellow author. There's a lot of links here. I see events. I see your blog. I see so much here. If a new person's coming to your website, where would you like them to start on your website?
Well, the homepage has my latest books, which is The Italian Soul, as I mentioned. And then I have a poetry collection coming out probably in June to 2025 this year, called How to Be a Contemplative. That's the title poem. You see, I never stray very far from what I'm passionate about. But I did write brief reflections to go with each poem. So it's not just straight poetry. There's reflections in it as well. And so, on the homepage, of course, you'll find out about the latest books. You'll find out about what the previous books were. But I'd love for people to go to two places: the blog, where I write pretty much every week, and it's really, I really try to be a contemplative living in the world in those blogs. I really try to show what that's like, and by what interests me that week that I'm writing about. And so the blog, I think people might like, and then the events page, to see, I do in person, I do a lot on Zoom, to see if they want to go on one of the retreats, for example, one of the spiritual retreats that I give, or hear a talk that I'm giving. If they see it, they can see on the events page if there's something in their area, or if there's something on Zoom they'd like to join in on.
Excellent. I love it. The one thing I see in your blog is a recent post around the new Pope.
Oh, yes.
Your thoughts of the new Pope, an American Pope. This is amazing. I'm pretty excited about this. What are your thoughts?
Lots of us thought we would never see an American Pope in our lifetimes. And the fact that he was a real protege of Pope Francis. I absolutely adored Pope Francis. I met him, got to talk to him, shake his hand. I will never forget that moment. That man was so clued into everything we should be focusing on, everything that should matter. For example, Pope Francis writing about the environment, Pope Francis writing about refugees, about everybody being welcome. He got a lot of heat for saying, the church should be for todos, 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 everybody, everybody, everybody. Because there are people who don't want gay people in the church, who don't want transgender people in the church. And Pope Francis took a lot of heat for that, but he was saying God created all of us, everyone. And I think this Pope, hopefully, knock wood, I hope this new Pope Leo, he's from Chicago, a city I spent most of my career in. I met the most wonderful Christians and Catholics in the city of Chicago. I mean, really people who try to live their faith. And he comes from that background, south side of Chicago. St. Xavier University, right there in the south side of Chicago. Catholic Theological Union, south side of Chicago. I hope that he will have learned from his mentor, Pope Francis, to be inclusive and to continue to want an inclusive church, to want a church that speaks to the times that we're in, and to keep speaking truth to power, especially on the whole refugee situation, the immigrant situation, the asylum situation. We were all at one time immigrants somewhere. And we've forgotten that for some reason. I don't know how we've forgotten it, but it's a message that's gotten ingrained now somehow in a large part of our society that we don't owe a lot to immigrants, and we owe a lot to immigrants in Canada, in the United States, everywhere.
Right. And that Statue of Liberty was one of the first things an immigrant would see
Yes.
as they arrive in this part of the world. And it meant so much for them. Freedom, safety, everything, right?
Absolutely. I think of that. I grew up seeing it from the window of our house, and that was the first thing my grandparents, all four of them coming from Italy, saw. And I mean, they literally came with nothing. And look, I mean, now we're 4 generations in this country. And look at, I have cousins who, one was a physicist, another worked for Homeland Security, several were teachers, some were in law enforcement. I became a national journalist. Look at what they gave to our country. I mean, these people who basically came with the clothes on their back, like the people who are coming right now. Right. Across the border. We should give them a chance to contribute.
I see and hear your passion, Judith. I'm sure that drips through everything that you write, through your pen and through your keyboard. I don't think that you can divorce yourself from your heart and the things that you're passionate about. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we're going to have links to your website, to your blog, and all the information as well in the show notes. Just a parting word for the readers, Judith, from your perspective. What do you want to leave us with as we wrap up?
Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. Follow your heart. Follow your dream. Even if you have to tune out the voices that tell you otherwise, just follow your heart, follow your soul, follow your dream, and write. If you want to write.
Excellent. Judith, thank you for a great conversation. I really enjoy talking to you. There's so much wisdom and knowledge that you have, and the fact that you have some time to share with us. Really appreciate it. On behalf of the audience, thank you so much for making this available to us today. I'm inviting everyone to go check out all the information in the show notes for Judith. Again, go to our website. When you buy all of her books, all of them, leave a great review so that other people will see what resonated with you as a reader, so that they will also follow your journey and also purchase Judith's books as well. I think that's one thing we can do as readers, is support our authors by leaving those great reviews. So that's my request for everyone as you listen to this. And Judith, again, thank you so much for this. Please keep me in mind as you continue to write. It is called Living the Next Chapter. Yes. So we're all about what's coming up in the future. I would love to have you back in the future as a guest and continue the conversation.
I'd be honored, David. Thank you for all you're doing for writers. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Everyone, everything is always in the show notes. Judith, thank you so much. Hey, thank you so much again for pressing play. As you've heard, great guests on the show. And one thing you didn't hear in this conversation is what? What did you not hear? Think about it for a second. That's right. Not a single solitary commercial for a mattress or a supplement or a whatever you call it. No. Why? Because we don't want to break up the conversation with commercials. So the fact that you're still here means that you are a fan of the show, I'm assuming. So if you want to help to keep the podcast going and to make me feel really happy, all I really care about is coffee, okay? I just got to be honest. I love coffee. I'm drinking one right now. It's starting to get cold. I need to warm it up. Helping us with our Buy Me a Coffee link over at livingthenextchapter.com and also in the show notes helps kind of keep the lights on around here. Remember, I'm doing this for free. I'm paying for everything. So I would love to have a little coffee donation, even $5 kind of fills up my cup. And I would love to enjoy a coffee from you. So if you're interested, again, thank you for listening. But you can use our Buy Me a Coffee link and fill up the cup. Thanks for being here.